She caught her husband kissing another woman, and instead of falling apart, she disappeared with their daughter and rebuilt her life from scratch. What followed was a journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and an incredible transformation no one saw coming. This isn't just a story about divorce, it's about rediscovering strength, setting boundaries, and choosing peace over pain. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life stories that hit straight to the heart. I used to think I knew what love looked like. It wore pressed shirts and drank black coffee. It left the house every morning with a peck on the cheek and a whispered, "You're my whole world, Claire." And I believed him. Every single time. My husband, Daniel Whitmore, was the man people admired. Neighbors called him steady. My friends called me lucky. I called him home. We lived in a quiet suburb just outside Indianapolis, in a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a yard big enough for a swing set. Every morning, I'd watch him reverse out of the driveway, one hand on the wheel, the other holding his phone already ringing with something urgent. He worked in finance, consulting, portfolios, mergers, the kind of job with a vocabulary that shut down most dinner conversations, but it paid well. We had the house, the SUV, the stroller with 12 cup holders. Our daughter, Sophie, was 3 and obsessed with dinosaurs. She carried a bright green plush triceratops everywhere, even to bed. She was my whole world, the heartbeat outside my body. I stayed home with her after she was born, and even on the worst days, when she melted down over the wrong kind of applesauce or refused to nap, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Daniel said the same, often, in text messages between meetings. "You're amazing with her. Couldn't do this without you. Love you, babe." But if I'm honest, something had shifted. It started with the small things. Daniel no longer lingered at the door in the morning. He didn't ask about my day when he got home. We used to sit on the couch after Sophie went to bed and share a glass of wine, watching whatever crime drama was trending. Lately, he watched TV alone, laptop open, phone buzzing, eyes unreadable. I chalked it up to stress. His firm, Harper and Whitmore Capital, had just landed a huge client. Daniel said he was being considered for a senior partner role. More pressure, more late nights, more silence. Then came the receipts. It was a Wednesday when I found the first one. I was folding laundry in our bedroom when his coat slipped off the bed. A small, glossy slip of paper fluttered out. Dinner for 2. St. Raphael's, a rooftop French restaurant in Chicago. I'd only been once years ago for our anniversary. The charge was nearly $300. I stared at it for a long time. At first, I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was with a client. But the signature on the receipt wasn't Daniel's. I knew his loops and slants by heart. This was someone else. When I asked him about it later that night, he didn't flinch. Networking dinner. Some investor out of New York, Townsend or Thompson or something. I nodded, smiled, told myself to believe him, and for a few days I managed to keep that lie afloat in my chest like a balloon. But every time I looked at him, I saw that receipt instead of his face. Every time his phone buzzed and he angled the screen away from me, I felt that cold slip of doubt slip deeper beneath my skin. I wanted so badly to be wrong. I wanted to believe he was just tired. That the man I married, the one who proposed on a snowy night in a New York park, who cried when Sophie was born, who once drove 2 hours to surprise me with my favorite pie, I wanted to believe he was still in there. So I made a plan. Daniel had another business trip coming up, Chicago again, a 2-day financial conference. He'd be staying at the Hyatt Regency, same place as before. I told him I'd be visiting my sister that weekend, just outside town, and he nodded distractedly, already scrolling through his phone. I lied. My sister lived 3 states away. I had no intention of leaving town, except to follow him. The day of the trip, I dropped Sophie off at my mother's house. She waved at me from the window, a peanut butter smudge on her cheek, completely unaware of the knot twisting in my stomach. I packed light. Just an overnight bag, a change of clothes, a pair of heels I hadn't worn since before Sophie was born. I told myself this was a romantic gesture, a surprise. Maybe I'd catch him off guard, we'd laugh about it, and whatever weird cloud had settled between us would finally clear. But part of me knew. The drive took 2 hours, made worse by traffic and second thoughts. I rehearsed a dozen scenarios in my head. What if he really was working? What if I embarrassed him in front of his colleagues? What if he was actually innocent? Chicago's skyline shimmered in the late afternoon sun, the glass towers sharp against the blue sky. I pulled into the Hyatt parking garage around 4:45 p.m., just in time for his supposed dinner break. I sent him a text, "Hey, surprise, come meet me in the lobby," and waited. I stood near the staircase, just under a massive crystal chandelier, watching people come and go. I'd worn my nicest dress, fixed my hair, smoothed out my nerves with a breath so deep it hurt. That's when I saw him. Daniel. He wasn't alone. She was tall, dark-haired, maybe mid-30s, and wore a fitted black coat that clung to her like it belonged there. They were sitting near the bar under a warm glow of pendant lights. She touched his arm as she laughed. He leaned in, and then he kissed her. Not a quick peck, not a friendly cheek brush. A slow, intimate, practiced kiss. My feet refused to move. My chest felt hollow, like something inside me had been scooped out. I must have stood there for minutes, heart pounding in my ears, face burning with disbelief. I wanted to scream, to storm over, to drag him out by his collar, but I couldn't even breathe. Eventually, I turned and walked away. I didn't remember getting back to the car. I don't remember pulling out of the garage or merging onto the highway. All I remember is gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached and thinking, over and over again, he kissed her like he used to kiss me. And in that moment, I knew the truth. The man I loved was gone. And he wasn't coming back. The drive back home from Chicago felt like floating in a nightmare, except everything was too sharp, too real. Traffic crawled, but I hardly noticed. I didn't hear the horns blaring around me or the hum of tires on asphalt. My fingers gripped the wheel, yet I felt nothing, like my hands belonged to someone else. The city lights faded behind me, but the image of Daniel kissing that woman burned behind my eyelids with relentless cruelty. I didn't cry. Not then. There was only numbness and eerie silence inside my chest. I kept expecting my emotions to catch up, to roar into grief or rage, but they didn't. It was like my heart had closed a heavy steel door and locked itself inside. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the neighborhood was blanketed in quiet. Porch lights flickered. A dog barked in the distance. Everything looked normal, which somehow made it worse, because nothing was normal. Nothing would ever be normal again. I walked through our front door and into the kitchen, where the scent of lavender cleaner and yesterday's coffee still lingered. The house greeted me like it always had. Warm, familiar, deceiving. There were Sophie's shoes by the door, a crayon drawing on the fridge that said, "I love you, Mommy," and a Tupperware of leftover casserole I'd made for Daniel's return. It all felt like a stage set for a life I no longer belonged to. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the living room couch, staring out the window into the darkness. My phone buzzed just after midnight. Daniel's name lit up the screen like an accusation. I didn't answer. What would I even say? "Hey, how's your mistress?" No, I wasn't ready. I needed space, just a little more time to process the wreckage before I faced him. He came home the next evening, duffel bag slung over his shoulder like he'd returned from a gym session. Not a betrayal. I heard the door creak open, heard the soft thud of his bag hitting the floor. "Hey, honey," he said, casual as ever. "Conference ran late. You didn't have to wait up." He kissed my cheek. I froze. I forced a smile. "I just wanted to see you." He moved into the kitchen, whistling as he poured himself a glass of water. I watched him from the doorway, his back turned, posture relaxed. The audacity of it struck me like a slap. He was so at ease, so confident in his lie. As if the kiss I saw had never happened. As if I hadn't stood 20 feet away, watching him erase our vows with one slow turn of his head. I stepped forward. "Did you have dinner with Mr. Townsend again?" He paused mid-sip. "Yeah," he said smoothly, turning around. "We talked shop, just like last time." There it was, the lie, delivered with the same calm tone he used when asking about the weather. I stared at him, searching his face for a flicker of guilt, but all I found was detachment. Something in me broke. "Stop lying to me, Daniel," I said, my voice shaking. "I saw you." The glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the tile. Water spread across the floor like a flood, pieces of glass catching the light in sharp little bursts. "You saw me?" he whispered, his face draining of color. "I was at the Hyatt," I said, barely holding myself together. "I saw you with her." The room filled with silence. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, my heartbeat, my breath. He opened his mouth, then closed it, again, Finally, he stammered, "It's not what you think." I laughed, a bitter guttural sound. "Really? Because it looked exactly like what I think. You and her, cozy, hands touching, lips locked, that about right?" He ran his hands through his hair. Her name is Marissa Hale. She's a colleague. We've been seeing each other." I stepped back as if he'd struck me. Hearing it out loud was worse than witnessing it. "Why?" I asked, my voice a whisper now. "Why would you do this to us?" Daniel took a step forward, but I flinched, and he stopped. "It just happened," he said, as if an affair was some natural disaster he'd stumbled into. "She understands my work, the pressure, the hours. It wasn't supposed to mean anything." "Don't you dare reduce this to stress and long hours," I snapped, tears finally sliding down my cheeks. "We have a daughter, Daniel, a life." He wiped at his face. "I never stopped loving you. It was a mistake." "That's a convenient word," I said, "but it doesn't undo anything." "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Claire, please." "No," my voice cracked. "I trusted you. I defended you. And you kissed her like I was already gone." I turned and fled the room, his voice calling after me. But I didn't stop. I locked myself in the bedroom and curled into a ball on the bed we used to share. It smelled like him. It made me sick. That night, I barely slept. I sat awake, replaying every memory, our wedding, Sophie's birth, every road trip and quiet evening, and watched them crumble under the weight of his betrayal. I listened to him pacing downstairs, making hushed phone calls. I knew they were to her. Marissa. The thought made me feel like I was sinking, pulled under by a current I couldn't fight. When dawn broke, I knew what I had to do. I dressed Sophie in her favorite overalls, brushed her curls, and packed her favorite stuffed triceratops. I moved quickly, methodically, packing only essentials, just enough for a few days, maybe longer. I wrote Daniel a note, short, blunt. "I'm taking Sophie. We need space. Don't follow us." I left it on the kitchen counter beside the broken glass he hadn't bothered to clean. That was all I needed to see. He couldn't even sweep up the mess he'd made. I loaded Sophie into the car, kissed her forehead, and told her we were going on a little adventure. She clapped. She didn't know the truth. Not yet. I started the engine and backed out of the driveway. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew what I was leaving behind. The highway stretched before me like an endless ribbon, winding through sleepy towns and open fields as the sun lifted over the horizon. I hadn't planned where I was going. I just drove, guided by instinct and the hollow ache in my chest. Sophie sat in the back seat, humming to herself as she clutched her stuffed triceratops, unaware that her world was shifting with every mile. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her round face lit by the golden morning light, and I felt the tears press against my throat. I swallowed them back. I couldn't cry, not in front of her. She needed me steady. She needed to believe this was just a fun little trip with Mommy. So I forced a smile whenever she asked, "Are we going to see Grandma? Or is Daddy coming too?" "No, sweetheart," I'd reply gently. "It's just us for a while." We stopped once for gas and snacks, apple slices, string cheese, juice boxes. I paid in cash, avoided eye contact with the cashier, and kept Sophie close. It felt like I was on the run, hiding from something, or maybe from everything. I turned off my phone. If Daniel tried to reach me, he'd find silence. I owed him nothing, least of all my location. After several hours on the road and 2 wrong turns, I found myself steering the car toward northern Michigan, where the air felt cleaner and time moved slower. I hadn't been there in years, but a distant memory had nudged its way into my mind. The quiet lakeside cabin belonging to my aunt, Beatrice. She was my mother's older sister, the black sheep of the family, a former school teacher who'd retired early and rarely came to family holidays. She was private, prickly, but kind in her own way. When I was 12, I'd spent 2 summer weeks at her place. It was the last time I remembered feeling truly weightless. I pulled over outside a small grocery store in a town called Elk River, dug through my glove box, and found the old address book I hadn't touched in years. By some miracle, her number hadn't changed. My fingers trembled as I dialed. She answered on the second ring. "Beatrice Whitaker." "Aunt Bea, it's Claire. Claire Whitmore." A pause. Softer. "Claire? My goodness. It's been a long time." "I know," I said, my voice catching. "I'm sorry for calling out of nowhere, but I don't know where else to go. I have Sophie with me. We just need somewhere quiet, somewhere safe." Another pause, then a sigh. "Come on up then. You remember the way? I think so. I'll put the kettle on. 2 hours later, I was pulling into her gravel driveway. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, nestled among towering pines with a view of the lake that shimmered under the afternoon sun. Beatrice stood on the porch in jeans and a flannel shirt, her silver hair pulled back in a braid. Her expression was unreadable, but she came down the steps without a word and opened the car door. Sophie peeked out shyly, holding her dinosaur close. "Hello there," Beatrice said softly. "You must be Sophie." Sophie nodded. "Well, you're just as cute as a button." Sophie giggled, and just like that, the ice broke. Inside, the cabin was warm and inviting. The living room smelled of pine wood and tea. Books lined the walls, and a knitted afghan draped over the couch. Sophie settled in instantly, mesmerized by the rocking chair in the corner and the ducks outside the window. I stood awkwardly in the kitchen, trying to find words that didn't sound like an apology. "You don't have to explain anything," Beatrice said gently as she handed me a steaming mug. "But if you want to talk, I'm here." I nodded, eyes burning. That night, once Sophie was asleep in the guest room and the stars had begun to prick the sky, I joined Beatrice on the back porch. We sat in silence for a while, wrapped in thick blankets, the lake stretching out before us like a mirror. "He cheated," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him. With another woman. At a hotel in Chicago." Beatrice didn't gasp. She didn't shake her head or rush to fill the silence. She simply let the truth settle between us, giving it space to breathe. "I'm sorry, Claire," she said at last. I thought we had something real. I gave up my career. I built my life around him, around us, and now it's like I don't even recognize the man I married." "You're not the first woman to feel that way," she murmured, "and you won't be the last. But you're here now, and you did the right thing." "Did I?" I asked, my voice cracking. I didn't even confront him properly. I just left. Beatrice turned to me, her expression firm. "You protected your daughter. That's not weakness, that's strength." I looked out at the lake, its surface undisturbed, like it had nothing to do with the chaos inside me. I don't even know what happens next. I don't have a job. I don't have a plan. All I know is I can't go back. Not yet. "You don't have to," she said. "You take all the time you need." And I believed her. In the days that followed, I began to feel pieces of myself again. I woke early and made breakfast with Sophie, who quickly decided she loved Aunt Bee's pancakes more than mine. We went on lawn walks through the trees, Sophie collecting rocks and pine cones, while I watched her with a fierce kind of protectiveness I hadn't known I was capable of. Beatrice gave us space. She didn't hover, didn't pry. But every evening, we sat on the porch with tea and quiet, and I let myself slowly unravel. I thought often of Daniel, what he might be thinking if he'd read the note, if he'd torn the house apart trying to figure out where I'd gone. I wondered if he was still with her. I wondered if he missed Sophie, if he missed me. But I didn't call. I couldn't. Not yet. One afternoon, while Sophie was napping, I stood in front of the guest room mirror and really looked at myself. My eyes were tired, and there were lines in places I didn't remember. But I also saw a woman who'd done something hard, who'd chosen the unknown over betrayal, who had something left worth fighting for. I walked outside and stood at the edge of the dock. The lake was still, the sky above it clear. I took a deep breath and said it aloud, just to hear it. "I'm not going back." And with that, the wind shifted. It didn't carry away the hurt, not all at once, but it made space for something else. For clarity, for courage, for the beginning of whatever would come next. The days at Aunt Beatrice's cabin passed like chapters in a quiet book, slow, rhythmic, and strangely healing. There was no chaos, no buzzing phone, no hurried meals or uncomfortable silences. Just the steady murmur of wind through pines, the gentle splash of lake water against the shore, and the soft patting of Sophie's feet as she explored the new world around her with wide-eyed wonder. I began to settle into a routine, not because I planned it, but because my soul craved the anchor. Mornings started with Sophie climbing into bed with me, her little body warm and wriggling, her dinosaur clutched tightly in her arms. We'd lie there for a few minutes, wrapped in the hush of early light, before getting up to make breakfast. Pancakes, oatmeal, toast with raspberry jam. Beatrice always seemed to have on hand. Afterward, we'd take long walks along the trail behind the cabin. Sophie would collect sticks and chase birds, her giggles echoing through the trees like music. I'd watch her, the way the sunlight danced in her curls, and feel a pang deep in my chest. Not just love, but the sorrow of knowing that this piece was born from something broken. One afternoon, as she napped, I found myself sitting alone on the dock, staring out at the lake. The water was perfectly still, a mirror to the sky above. It reminded me of the life I used to have, on the surface, smooth and bright, but underneath, hidden currents, lies, secrets, a storm waiting to rise. That was the day I let myself cry. Not a few quiet tears, no. This time, it was everything. All the pain I'd held in since the moment I saw Daniel in that hotel lobby. The rage, the humiliation, the betrayal. I cried for our wedding day, for the promises he broke, for every bedtime story he'd miss with Sophie because of his choices. I cried until my chest ached and my breath came in hiccups. When I finally stopped, the lake hadn't changed. It still shimmered. It didn't care about my heartbreak. And in that indifference, I found a strange kind of comfort. Life would go on. The earth wouldn't stop spinning because my marriage fell apart. And neither would I. Beatrice joined me a few minutes later, saying nothing. She handed me a fresh cup of tea and sat down beside me, the old wood of the dock groaning gently beneath us. We watched a loon glide across the water in silence. I don't know what to do next, I admitted finally. I can't stay here forever, but I'm not ready to go home, not even close. Then don't, she said simply. You don't owe anyone a timeline, Claire, especially not him. I nodded, gripping the mud tighter. He doesn't even know where we are. That's probably for the best. For a while, I thought about what she'd said. About the fact that, for the first time in years, I was in control. I'd always deferred to Daniel, his schedule, his job, his needs. I had built my world around his orbit, thinking it was love. But love shouldn't feel like self-erasure. Love should be partnership, equal, honoring. And Daniel had chosen someone else. Repeatedly, with intention. That evening, after Sophie went to bed, I found myself in Beatrice's study, scanning the shelves until my eyes landed on a thick blue binder marked Tax Year 2009. I opened it, curious, and found a stack of envelopes, each labeled in Beatrice's careful script: gas bill, groceries, property tax. The woman had documented every penny. My mind wandered to my own life. Bills paid automatically, bank statements I rarely read, credit cards Daniel controlled. When had I stopped owning my life? Beatrice found me thumbing through the folders. She raised an eyebrow. Thinking about spreadsheets already? She teased. I think I want to start over, I said. Not just hide, not just escape. I want to rebuild. She walked over and opened a drawer in her desk, pulling out a spiral notebook and a ballpoint pen. Then start here. That night, I stayed up late, sitting at the kitchen table while the house slept. I made a list. Nothing grand, just the beginning of a plan. Look into part-time work, maybe freelance writing. Research daycare options. Start a budget. Contact a lawyer. Each bullet point felt like a brick being laid beneath my feet. When I woke up the next morning, Sophie was already at the kitchen table with Beatrice, who was teaching her how to butter toast. The sight of them, my daughter so safe, so loved, and Beatrice so quietly present, filled me with a gratitude I didn't know how to express. I mouthed, "Thank you," and Beatrice just gave me a small nod, as if to say, "You're welcome, but this is just what family does." That day, I drove into town alone while Beatrice watched Sophie. I found a little cafe with decent Wi-Fi and a bulletin board covered in handwritten ads for things like dog walking, guitar lessons, and firewood delivery. I sat at a corner table with my laptop and searched: divorce lawyers Michigan, single mom budgeting, remote jobs with flexible hours. Each click brought me closer to the woman I wanted to become. I didn't tell Daniel where we were. Not yet. He hadn't tried to call again, or if he had, I wouldn't know. My phone stayed off, buried at the bottom of my purse, like a relic of another life. I wasn't ready to hear his voice. Not until I had one of my own again. One afternoon, Beatrice and I sat on the porch, watching Sophie dance around the yard in her rain boots. The air smelled of lilacs and something on the edge of summer. I keep wondering if I'll ever feel whole again, I said softly. Beatrice sipped her tea. You won't. Not in the same way. But you'll build something new. Something better. I looked at her, this woman who'd lived alone in the woods for decades, who had never needed a husband to define her, who had welcomed me without judgment or pity. I don't think I ever really knew who I was, I admitted. Then now's the time to find out. Later that week, I found an old journal tucked into my suitcase, one I hadn't opened in years. I flipped through it and landed on a page from before Sophie was born. What if I lose myself? I'd written. What if being a wife and mother swallows me whole? I smiled bitterly. I'd been right to worry. But now, for the first time, I was asking a better question. What if I found myself again? That night, after Sophie was asleep and the stars were bright above the lake, I walked out to the dock alone. I stood barefoot on the cold wood, wrapped in a sweater, and whispered into the wind, I'm still here. I'm not broken. I'm just becoming. The trees rustled in reply, and I let the stillness hold me. Not like silence, but like a pause between breaths, the kind that comes right before something begins. It was late afternoon when I first saw his car. I was watering the lavender bushes by the side porch, the hose warm in my hands and Sophie playing with her plastic watering can nearby. A cardinal chirped somewhere in the trees, the breeze stirred the scent of pine and soil, and for a fleeting second, the world felt steady. Then a dark sedan pulled slowly into the gravel driveway, its windows tinted, the tires crunching like broken glass underfoot. My heart stopped. Sophie didn't notice. She was busy soaking her shoes and giggling. But I knew. I didn't need to see the license plate. I recognized the shape of the car, the slant of the windshield, the way the driver's door opened like hesitation. Daniel. He stepped out slowly, dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt rolled to the elbows, an outfit meant to look casual but carefully chosen. His hair was a little longer, his face thinner. He looked tired, older. There were dark shadows under his eyes. For the briefest moment, something flickered in my chest, something like grief or maybe recognition of what once was. Beatrice came out onto the porch before I could speak. She stood beside me, her expression unreadable. I knew he'd come eventually, she said softly. I didn't think he'd find us. Men like that don't know how to let go. They only know how to chase what they broke. I straightened my shoulders, trying to steady the shaking in my limbs. Daniel approached, stopping a few feet away. He looked from me to Sophie, then back again. Claire, he said, almost like a breath. You're here. You're okay. I was always okay, I said, sharper than I meant to. He looked down, his hands clenching at his sides. Can we talk? I didn't answer right away. I felt Beatrice's presence behind me, solid, unyielding. After a beat, I nodded. Fine, but not here, not in front of her. I turned to Beatrice. Can you watch Sophie for a bit? Of course. Sophie barely noticed the shift. She waved at Daniel, shyly, unsure, then followed Beatrice inside, her little boots squelching from all the water. I walked down the grassy slope toward the dock without looking back to see if he followed. He did. The lake was calm, the late light painting everything gold. We stood at the edge, just like I had so many nights before, but now the stillness between us was heavy, full of things unsaid. Daniel spoke first. I hired a private investigator. I didn't know what else to do. You left, Claire. You took Sophie. I was scared. I didn't look at him. Scared? Of what? That your secret would stay buried too long? No, he said quickly. Scared I'd never see you again. Scared I'd never see our daughter. The sound of our daughter on his lips made my stomach twist. It was true, but it felt false too, like a title he hadn't earned. You didn't seem so concerned about us when you were kissing her. He winced. I deserved that. Damn right you did. I ended it with her, he said, voice low. Marissa, it's over. I finally turned to face him. That doesn't undo what you did. I know. I saw you, Daniel. I stood 20 feet away while you kissed her like I never existed. Like our marriage didn't exist. Like our daughter didn't exist. His mouth trembled. I never meant to hurt you. I laughed. It was bitter, joyless. You didn't trip and fall into an affair. You made 100 choices that led you there. You lied to my face. You let me doubt myself. You slept beside me and told me everything was fine. I was overwhelmed, he said weakly. Work, the pressure. Don't, I snapped. Don't insult me with excuses. You don't get to blame this on your job. I had pressure too. I had a toddler hanging off me 24 hours a day, no adult conversation, no help, and still, I didn't betray you. He looked away, ashamed. The breeze stirred his hair, and he rubbed the back of his neck like a boy caught in a lie. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. But I had to see you. I had to see Sophie. I've been going crazy. I crossed my arms, defensive. What do you want, Daniel? He looked me dead in the eyes. I want to make it right. I'll quit my job if I have to. I'll go to therapy. I'll move out of the city. I'll do anything. I stared at him, stunned by the desperation in his voice. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. You want to fix this, I said quietly, but you can't glue together something you shattered on purpose. His face crumpled. Do you hate me? I paused, swallowing hard. I hate what you did. I hate how you made me doubt myself. I hate that I have to explain to Sophie why her daddy doesn't live with us anymore. But no, I don't hate you. He took a tentative step forward. Is there still hope, even just a little? I shook my head. Not now. Maybe not ever. But Sophie deserves her father, and you deserve the chance to earn that role back. As for me, I don't know yet. He nodded slowly. Can I see her? I took a breath, then nodded. Tomorrow morning. She's napping now. He smiled faintly. Thank you. We stood there a while longer, the water lapping gently at the dock, the silence now less suffocating. I could feel the cracks in me, not broken, but changed. I wasn't the same woman he'd left behind, and I didn't want to be. When we returned to the cabin, Beatrice met us at the door, arms crossed. He'll be gone soon, I assured her. Good, she said, then looked at Daniel. Don't make her regret letting you see your child. He nodded solemnly. That night, after everyone was asleep, I sat by Sophie's bed, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. Her face was peaceful, untouched by the mess her parents had made. I stroked her hair, whispered promises I hadn't yet figured out how to keep, and reminded myself why I had left in the first place. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't punishment, it was protection. For her. For me. When dawn arrived, I found Daniel already waiting outside on the porch, holding a paper bag of pastries and coffee. He looked up with cautious hope as I opened the door. She's awake, I said. You can see her for a little while. He nodded. Thank you, Claire. As he stepped inside, I stayed behind, staring at the lake, its surface catching the first light of day. The water didn't care who loved who left, who broke what. It just kept moving. And so would I. It was 3 days after Daniel's visit when the calm finally cracked. Since his arrival, things had been cautiously civil. He rented a small cabin a few miles down the lake, respecting the boundaries I'd drawn. He came by each morning for an hour with Sophie, always knocking gently, always waiting to be invited. I stayed close during those visits, sipping coffee on the porch or folding laundry in the kitchen while they played in the yard. It was strange, watching him laugh with her, braid her hair clumsily, carry her on his shoulders like nothing had changed when everything had. But we didn't speak much, and when we did, it was about Sophie. Her bedtime, her favorite snacks, whether she was still afraid of thunder. That was the rule. Nothing personal, nothing about us. And then, just as I began to think we might have a rhythm, a fragile, uncomfortable rhythm, the storm hit. I remember the moment like it happened in slow motion. I was walking Sophie back from Beatrice's garden. She had a small basket of cherry tomatoes in one hand, dirt smudged on her cheeks, her sun hat askew. We were halfway to the front steps when a car I didn't recognize pulled up the driveway in a burst of gravel. A sleek silver coupe. City plates. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Marissa. I froze. The air thinned. She was tall, angular, and dressed like she'd just stepped out of a fashion editorial. Black blouse, tailored pants, oversized sunglasses. She looked around, taking in the cabin, the lake, the simplicity of it all, with something between disgust and disbelief. I stepped in front of Sophie. Get inside, I whispered, handing her the basket. Go find Aunt Bea. But, now baby, please. Sophie obeyed, sensing something wasn't right. Marissa strode forward, her heels clicking against the wooden porch steps with deliberate confidence. So, she said, voice smooth and icy, this is where he ran off to. Playing house with his precious little family again. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I could. I've been calling him for over a week, she continued. He blocked me, coward, and then I had to hear through a coworker that he quit. Just like that. No goodbye, no explanation. I stepped down onto the gravel, keeping my distance. You shouldn't be here. Neither should he, she shot back. But apparently, he thinks abandoning everything is the answer, including me. I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel had arrived, likely hearing the commotion, his face drained of color when he saw her. Marissa, he said, shocked. What are you doing here? What am I doing? She repeated, her voice rising. I followed you, Daniel. You vanished. You made me look like a fool. And now I find you playing devoted dad like this whole affair never happened. He stepped between us. You need to leave. She laughed bitterly. That's rich, coming from you. You dragged me into this mess. You said you weren't in love with her anymore, that you didn't see a future with Claire. And now look at you. My mouth went dry. The words hit me like a slap, sharp and humiliating. But I didn't flinch. Not in front of her. You don't get to rewrite history, I said, voice low. He lied to both of us, but you knew he was married. You knew he had a child. Her eyes narrowed. Don't you dare pin this all on me. Your marriage was already dead. That's why he came to me. And that's when I lost it. Before I could think, my hand flew. A sharp crack rang out as my palm connected with her cheek. She staggered back, stunned. Daniel jumped forward. Claire. Marissa stared at me, one hand on her face, shock morphing into fury. You're insane. No, I said, breathless. I'm a mother, and I won't let you poison what little peace we found. At that moment, Sophie appeared in the doorway, eyes wide, clutching her stuffed dinosaur. The look on her face, confused, scared, snapped me back to myself. Tears stunned my eyes. I turned to Daniel. This is exactly why I left, I said, voice trembling. It's never just about us. It's chaos. It's lies. It's humiliation. Daniel's expression collapsed. Claire, no, I cut him off. I need to protect my daughter and myself. I can't keep reopening this wound just because you're sorry. He didn't argue. He just stood there, speechless, while Marissa stormed back to her car, slamming the door so hard it echoed across the trees. She peeled out of the driveway, the tires spitting gravel, and disappeared down the road. I stood there for a long moment, my hands shaking, my heart pounding. Daniel finally spoke. I'll go. I'm sorry. Good, I said, not meeting his eyes. That night, after Sophie was asleep and the house had gone still, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. I stared at the blank page for several minutes before writing 2 words at the top: divorce attorney. Beatrice didn't say a word when I told her the next morning. She just handed me the phone book and said, you already know what's right. I found the name through a local acquaintance, Michael Sanders. Clean reputation, honest, experienced with custody cases. I called his office from the cafe downtown. When he answered, I felt my voice shake. I need help, I said. I need to file. His tone was calm, reassuring. We'll take care of it, Miss Whitmore. The next day, I drove to his office in town. It was a modest building with a wood sign out front and a small waiting room with potted plants and worn magazines. Michael was in his mid-40s, sharp-eyed but kind. He listened as I explained my situation, never interrupting, never judging. I'm not trying to destroy him, I said. I just want peace. I want to make decisions that protect my daughter and give me room to breathe again. He nodded. We'll file for custody here, in Michigan. You'll need to establish temporary residency, but you've already been here long enough to begin that process. We'll build a strong case. I don't want this to turn ugly. Sometimes it will, whether we want it to or not. But you won't go through it alone. When I left his office, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. No more maybes. No more waiting to see if Daniel would change. No more giving him the benefit of the doubt just because I once loved the man he used to be. That night, after Sophie fell asleep with her dinosaur in her arms, I stood outside the cabin and looked up at the stars. They blinked down, silent and indifferent, as if to say, the world is vast. You're small, but you're still here. I closed my eyes and let the cool night air settle on my skin. I was ready to finish this. Not out of vengeance, but out of love, for myself and for the little girl sleeping just inside, whose life I refused to let be shaped by someone else's betrayal. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in a thick manila envelope to Daniel's rented cabin down the road. I hadn't warned him. I didn't owe him that. He had seen what I'd seen, his mistress on my front porch, my hand flying, our daughter crying, and he knew. There was no future left to salvage, only pieces to clean up and a path to lay down for Sophie. I was sitting at the kitchen table, folding Sophie's laundry, when Beatrice poked her head in from the front door. He's here, she said simply. I didn't ask if he looked upset. I didn't ask if he looked broken. I only stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked out to the porch. Daniel stood holding the envelope like it weighed 100 pounds. His eyes were red, but there were no tears, just the tight, unreadable expression of a man who had finally arrived at the edge of a cliff and realized the bridge was gone. "I got them," he said quietly. "I know. Is this really what you want?" I didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the trees, lifting the scent of pine and wildflowers. Sophie was out back with Beatrice, chasing butterflies with her little net. I finally looked him in the eye. "I don't see any other way." His shoulders sagged just slightly. "I thought maybe we could try counseling. Or—" "We tried coexisting," I interrupted. "And look what happened. You brought your affair into our home, into my driveway. Sophie was there, Daniel. She saw that woman scream at me. She saw me hit someone. Do you really think that's something I can explain away in therapy?" He looked down, ashamed. "I never meant for it to get so far." "But it did," I said. "And the moment you let her become a part of your life, you took a sledgehammer to mine." "I know. I don't hate you," I added, surprising both of us. "But I can't keep waiting for you to become the man I hoped you were. I'm done hoping." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing a truth he'd resisted for too long. "And Sophie?" he asked. "What happens with her?" "We'll figure out a custody arrangement," I said. "You'll see her. She deserves a father, but not one who brings chaos and guilt into her life. You'll have to work for her trust and for mine." He looked away, blinking hard. Before he turned to go, he stopped at the edge of the porch. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said. "I love you. I always will." I didn't answer. I just stood there, letting the silence do the talking. When he walked away, I didn't follow him with my eyes. I looked up at the sky instead, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was drowning. The weeks that followed were full of paperwork, quiet nights, and hard conversations with lawyers. Michael Sanders was steady and thoughtful, walking me through every step without condescension. We filed in Michigan. Daniel contested, of course. He tried to move it back to Indiana, but Michael had already built the case around our residency. We were solid. Mediation followed. Long hours in bland offices. Daniel and I sat across from each other, dividing a life we had once vowed to share. The house, the savings, the holiday schedules. It was strange, parsing through everything like it was inventory. But we did it for Sophie. She was the constant in all of it, the tether to what mattered. Daniel agreed to joint legal custody, but I retained physical custody. Sophie would live with me. He'd get holidays, some weekends, and a summer month if things stayed civil. I didn't want to shut him out. I just needed boundaries. He surprised me by not fighting it. Maybe he finally understood. Marissa, meanwhile, vanished. I heard through Beatrice's neighbor, whose daughter worked at Harper and Whitmore, that she'd resigned. Rumor had it she'd moved to New York. Started over. Maybe she thought she could erase it all with a zip code change. I didn't envy her. She'd walked into a fire thinking it was a fireplace. What I didn't expect was the support I got from my mother. Linda Pierce had always been a traditional woman, the kind who believed marriage was for life, that forgiveness was noble, and that women should make things work. But when she came to visit us at the lake one weekend and saw how bright Sophie looked, how peaceful I seemed, how warm Beatrice's world had become, she changed her tune. She sat beside me on the porch one night, sipping lemon tea, watching Sophie toss pebbles into the water. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. I looked at her, surprised. "For leaving," she added. "For protecting her. I wouldn't have had that courage." We sat in silence for a while. She held my hand. Somewhere in those days, I started writing again. I'd majored in communications, once dreamed of becoming a writer. That dream got buried beneath diapers and grocery lists and Daniel's relentless schedule. But now, in the quiet of the lake, I wrote during nap time. At night, whenever the house settled and my thoughts could spill. I submitted a piece to an online parenting magazine. They published it. Then another. Then someone offered to pay me. Just like that, I remembered I had something of value that wasn't tethered to being someone's wife. Daniel took a job at a smaller firm. Less prestige, fewer hours. He started therapy, I heard. I don't know if it was genuine or performative, but it didn't matter. He was trying. For Sophie's sake, that had to be enough. And then, one cold Monday morning in late October, I got the envelope I'd been waiting for. The final decree. Divorce finalized. I stood by the window, holding it like some strange trophy. I thought I'd cry, but I didn't. I just felt clean, like something had been scrubbed away, leaving me raw but ready. That afternoon I took Sophie down to the lake. The wind was brisk and the trees had started to shed their leaves. She found a shiny pebble and held it up to me with pride. "For you, Mommy," she said. I knelt, cupped her small hand, and looked into her eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. It's beautiful." She didn't know what that moment meant, but I did. It was the end of something, and the beginning of something else entirely. Later that evening, as I sat at my laptop, I began searching for places to rent nearby. I didn't want to live in Beatrice's shadow forever, though I'd be grateful to her until my last breath. I needed a place of my own. A place for me and Sophie. Something small, simple, close to the lake. The phone rang. It was Daniel. He was calling to confirm next weekend's visit. The conversation was brief, polite, no bitterness, no pleading, just two people who once shared a life, now sharing a child. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. I had survived the fire, and somehow I hadn't turned to ash. I'd been forged into something new, not just stronger, but freer. And for the first time in a long time, I looked forward to whatever tomorrow would bring. The snow had long melted, and spring settled in with its quiet confidence. Buds on branches, the smell of fresh earth, the loons returning to the lake like clockwork. Life had begun to feel ordinary again. Not the old kind of ordinary, the carefully constructed illusion of suburbia, but something simpler, softer, more real. Sophie had grown bolder in those months. She raced barefoot through the grass with a kite trailing behind her. She learned to skip rocks, sort of, and she spoke with a vocabulary that made her sound older than her 3 years. She had stopped asking when Daddy was coming home. Instead, she asked when she'd see him next. It stung the first time, but over time, I understood the difference. She wasn't waiting. She was simply including him in her new rhythm. Daniel kept to the schedule. He'd drive up on weekends, stay in a motel near town, and take Sophie for ice cream or to the small library by the marina. I watched from the periphery, not with anger, not anymore, but with the cautious neutrality of someone still guarding the gates to her heart. He never asked to come inside. He didn't call late. He didn't push. He was trying in the only way he knew how, and though it wasn't enough to rebuild what we had, it was enough for our daughter. Beatrice noticed it too. One afternoon, she leaned against the kitchen counter, drying her hands, and said, "You're standing taller lately." I smiled at her. It's strange. I thought getting divorced would make me feel diminished, like a failure. And now I feel like I passed through a fire and came out tempered. She nodded, approving. "That's because you did." I'd found a little rental on the edge of town, 2 bedrooms, sloped roof, peeling paint on the shutters, but a view of the lake through the back windows that made up for it. I painted Sophie's room lavender and bought a yellow kitchen table from a thrift store. The house smelled like fresh paint and lemon oil and possibility. I brought over only what mattered, our books, some clothes, a few framed photos. Everything else I'd left behind with the ashes of my old life. I'd also started working more. The parenting magazine offered me a regular column. Then a podcast invited me on as a guest. Then someone asked me to write about starting over after betrayal. The words came easily, sometimes painfully, but always honestly. I wrote late into the night, barefoot on the porch with my laptop, a cup of tea, and a heart that no longer felt like glass. One Friday evening, Daniel arrived early. Sophie hadn't gotten home from preschool yet, so he waited on the front step. I stepped outside, unsure if he'd come to talk or just pass the time. He stood when he saw me. "Place looks great," he said. "You did it." "Thanks. I passed the house on Elm," he added. "The old one. Our old one." I nodded but said nothing. "They repainted it. Blue now. Looks different." "Everything's different." "Yeah," he said after a pause. "It is." We sat in silence for a while on the front steps, listening to the wind rustle the trees, the occasional bark of a dog down the road. "You know," he said finally, "I still think about that night at the hotel." "So do I. I see your face. The second you saw me with her. I was laughing one moment and then boom, you were just there." And it was like everything fell apart. I looked at him, not with rage, not anymore, but with clarity. "That's because it did fall apart. But it didn't start at the hotel. It started long before that. You just didn't notice." He lowered his eyes. "I still love her," he said suddenly. For a moment, I thought he meant me. But then he added, "Sophie. I mean, God, Claire, I love her so much." "I know you do," I said. I just wanted to say it out loud. Just then, Sophie's school van pulled into the drive, and she tumbled out with a glittery backpack and a half-eaten granola bar. She squealed when she saw him. "Daddy!" Daniel lit up like someone turned the world back on. He scooped her up, kissed her forehead, and twirled her in the air. I watched her laugh, watched his arms steady her little body, and felt something that wasn't jealousy or sadness. It was gratitude. Because even if he failed as a husband, he was trying as a father. When they left for the evening, I stood on the porch long after their car disappeared from view. I remembered a line I'd once read. Not everything that is broken is meant to be mended. Some things are meant to teach you where not to step again. That night, after Sophie was asleep, I sat on the dock behind our little rental. The stars were out, brighter than usual, like they were trying to fill the space above me with something holy. I wrapped myself in a knit blanket and opened my notebook. I didn't write about Daniel. I didn't write about heartbreak. I wrote about Sophie's giggle, about the smell of spring, about the rhythm of forgiveness, not as a gift to him, but to myself. Weeks later, the court finalized the last of the custody paperwork. It was official. We were no longer just two people with a child. We were co-parents, sharing responsibility for a bright, joyful soul we both loved with everything we had. Daniel still called before visits, still asked how Sophie was doing, still kept the boundaries clean and the conversations short. Eventually, he told me he was dating someone new. Not Marissa. Someone different. He said it with hesitation, maybe expecting me to react. But I didn't. I told him I hoped it worked out. And I meant it. Because love, even broken love, should never be a prison. Sometimes I see my reflection in the lake, and I don't recognize the woman staring back. Not because I'm lost, but because I've changed. The girl who married Daniel was soft-spoken and eager to please. The woman standing here now? She speaks with intention. She doesn't beg for crumbs. She knows who she is, even if that knowledge came with scars. One morning, as I was brushing Sophie's hair, she asked, "Mommy, are you happy?" I paused, looked at her in the mirror, and smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, I really am." She grinned and stuck a sticker on my cheek. I left it there. And just like that, we got ready for the day. A new day. One that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. One that didn't start with heartbreak or end in fear. Just breakfast, sunshine, and the quiet knowledge that we'd made it through the storm. And we were still standing, stronger, wiser, whole. Not because everything had gone right, but because when it all went wrong, I chose us. Thank you so much for staying with me through this story. If you're still here, it means you believe, like I do, that even in the darkest chapters of life, there is always a way forward. This wasn't just a story about betrayal or divorce. It was about strength, the quiet, steady kind that shows up when everything else falls apart. It's about a woman who lost nearly everything and found herself instead. Sometimes we think walking away is weakness. But as Claire showed us, walking away can be the bravest, most powerful thing you'll ever do. Especially when you're doing it for your child, your peace, and your future. So where are you watching from? I'd love to know. Drop your city or country in the comments. I read every one. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own journey, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience, heartbreak, healing, and the courage it takes to begin again. Until next time, take care of yourself. You are stronger than you think.